Before the video starts, shout out to the Gold Coast Railroad Museum. They need a bit of help right now with repairs and certifications, so any donations are appreciated. I'll leave a link in the description, please go throw some change their way. Thanks, bye. Despite how essential they are to most railway operations, not every railway in the world could afford to use locomotives. Companies such as mines or logging tramways didn't always turn enough profit to buy and run a steam engine, and so some had to resort to building their own out of whatever they had to hand or rely on workers and horses to push and pull wagons up and down the line. One railway, however, was so broke that they had to run their line with geese. In its heyday, the Rio Grande Southern Railroad thrived on transporting minerals through Colorado and New Mexico. But by 1893, the silver panic and the following economic turmoil caused most of the mines the railroad served to close down. With its main source of revenue gone, the Rio Grande resorted to moving passengers, livestock, mail, lumber, and whatever mineral traffic it could to keep going. And while this did help the railroad turn a profit, it wasn't nearly as much as the line initially earned. Not helping was how costly the railroad was to maintain. Heavy rains often caused bridges to wash out and damage trestles, mudslides would often block and distort tracks, and snows in the winter would leave some parts of the line inaccessible without heavy snow-clearing equipment. As such, the 3-foot gauge rails were notoriously ill-maintained on many parts of the line. Locomotives were only steamed when absolutely necessary, and passenger trains only ran at peak hours. As endearing as this poor man's just-getting-by railroad was, it wasn't enough to keep it operational forever. Stacking maintenance and running costs only got worse during the Great Depression, until eventually the line was unable to afford the fuel or the crew to run a single engine. The only reliable source of income the railroad had was the contract to deliver mail to towns around the mountains, and not wanting to lose it, the Rio Grande needed to find a way to run trains for next to nothing. Then, in 1931, the railroad superintendent Jack Odenbaugh had an idea. Why not use cars? Years earlier, in 1913, the railroad had built an inspection vehicle out of a Model T Ford. It was involved in an accident and eventually broken up in 1925, but it had proven to be cheap and reliable to run. As such, the Rio Grande purchased a Buick Master 6 sedan and modified it to run on the line, replacing the front axle with a four-wheeled bogie and extending the rear into an open platform. The resulting vehicle was dirt cheap to build, fuel, and required only one person to operate it. Numbered 1, it was an instant success for delivering mail, and despite its lack of comfort, ended up replacing the steam passenger service between Dolores and Durango. Seeing the savings the railcar provided, another was built the same year, again made out of a Buick, but this time fitted with a larger, enclosed freight compartment at the back, a driven 2-axle bogie instead of a single axle like number 1, and a larger cab at the front for passengers to ride in, capable of carrying 4 people. Numbered 2, this quickly took over passenger and freight work, and it wasn't long before the railroad wanted more. In 1932, railcar number 3 was built out of a Pierce Arrow limousine. This car was much bigger than the previous 2, being fitted with 3 sets of bogies, a larger, almost boxcar-sized freight compartment, was articulated to help negotiate tight bends, and had plenty more seats at the front, allowing it to carry up to 10 passengers. This design ended up becoming the standard for the railroad, with number 4 built the same year following the same layout, along with number 5 built in 1933 and number 7 built in 1936. Once number 5 came into service in 1933, the Rio Grande stopped running steam-hauled passenger services altogether, relying solely on the railcars to keep them going. Number 1 by this point was too small and underpowered to be of much use, and so it was broken up for parts, most of which were used to build number 6 in 1934. Unlike the others, number 6 only had a flatbed and a small cab, being used as a work train replacing the steam-hauled one. Number 2 also became too small for daily use, but was kept to one side as a spare. Occasionally, some goods trains were hauled by a steam locomotive, but for the most part it was just these railcars keeping the Rio Grande running in the Rockies. They soon became quite the common sight for locals, and were eventually given the nickname of the Galloping Geese. The poorly maintained tracks often caused the cars to lean side to side, making them look as if they were waddling as they travelled. On top of this, the hood covers would often be lifted to the side to help cool the engine, resembling a pair of flapping wings, and them being fitted with horns instead of whistles only added to their goose-like nature. Over time, the Geese were modified and upgraded to keep up with their work, with number 2 being fitted with a Pierce Arrow car body and a better engine in 1939, and numbers 3, 4 and 5 had new, more spacious Wayne bus company bodies fitted in 1946, and new straight-six engines that were surplus from the war. As amazing as the Geese were at saving the Rio Grande money, they weren't exactly the pinnacle of rail travel. Not only would passengers have to be in the same cab as the driver, but were also often quite cramped on busy days, and had to suffer from a lack of air conditioning in the summer and little heating in the winter. The cargo spaces were built with wooden frames, and the thin sheet metal was just nailed on. As you can imagine, it didn't take much to dent it. Even the seats in the initial railcars were cheap. The passenger seat in number 2 was just a couch from one of the Rio Grande's offices that was taken and dumped in the back. The Geese were also no stranger to derailing too. While their lightweight and lower centre of mass allowed them to better negotiate the often uneven rails, they still had their fair share of accidents. Regardless, the fact the Geese could run the line for next to nothing allowed the Rio Grande Southern to finally turn a profit, and by 1940 the line was able to run regular steam-hauled freight services again. Things were looking good until 1951, when heavy snows during the winter proved to be too much for the Geese to handle, causing them to fall behind on the mail and eventually lose the contract to road competition. With their biggest moneymaker gone, the Rio Grande Southern tried to make ends meet by equipping Geese 3, 4 and 5 with extra seats and windows to carry tourists and officially classing the railcars as Galloping Goose, in an attempt to capitalise on their quirky nature and the beautiful scenery the railway passed through. This unfortunately didn't work. The railroad filed for abandonment in 1952, and both 6 and 7 spent their last few days on the line pulling up rails. Given the Rio Grande Southern had a habit of cannibalizing the engines for spare parts to keep the others running, it's surprising that 6 of the 7 Geese managed to survive until the end of the line. Even more surprising is that all 6 have been preserved thanks to the interest of enthusiasts, and are still operational to this day, with a replica of number 1 built in 2000 to complete the set. While it isn't unheard of for some railways to cobble together rolling stock out of spare parts and scrap to fill a need, the Galloping Geese of the Rio Grande certainly stand out among the rest. Their rough around the edges appearance, little quirks, and the fact they pretty much financially carried an entire railroad just goes to show that locomotives don't always need to be a mallard to be great. Sometimes you can just make do with a goose. Subscribe for more.